Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker. You are not walking into a brightly lit restaurant with polished tiles and stainless steel counters. Instead, you crouch beneath the low beams of a medieval kitchen where the only illumination comes from an open hearth, spitting sparks against the blackened stone. Smoke curls upward into the rafters. And although there is a hole in the roof that is supposed to act as a chimney, the air is still so thick with haze that your eyes sting and your throat feels scratched. The sound of a wooden ladle clanging against iron echoes across the gloom, and the smell is not the kind of comforting aroma you imagine from a kitchen. It is a pungent mixture of old fat, burnt porridge, and damp straw underfoot. This is where meals begin, and for most people of the Middle Ages, meals were less about flavor and more about not starving. You would not last a day in this kind of kitchen without complaining. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you feel like joining in, let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the hearth, careful not to trip over the three-legged stools scattered across the dirt floor. The cook, her face shiny with sweat and ash, does not greet you like a guest but shouts at an apprentice to fetch more firewood. Fires never truly go out here. They are banked with ashes at night and coaxed back in the morning because flint and tinder are not things you waste time with every day. In fact, the entire rhythm of the household revolves around this one fire. Meat is roasted on spits, gruel is boiled in cauldrons, bread is baked in clay ovens heated with burning logs. The kitchen is the center of life, but it is also a place of chaos. Animals scurry about, dogs beg under tables, and sometimes a goose or chicken escapes into the corner. You probably imagine food being served quickly once it is cooked, but in this world, timing is anything but simple. Without refrigeration, without preservatives beyond salt and smoke, meals are dictated by what is available right now. The smell of stale fish lingers, reminding you that yesterday's catch is today's problem. Freshness is fleeting. The cook mutters about how even the lords upstairs do not eat what they demand. They expect white bread, game, and delicate sauces, but often they must settle for tough mutton cabbage and ale watered down just enough to stretch through the week. One mainstream fact is that bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet. Even in this smoky kitchen, the central task is kneading dough, a labor that never ends. Querns grind barley and rye, and flour dust hangs in the air like ghostly powder. Without bread, there is no meal, no sense of satisfaction. Yet, alongside this reality, there is a quirkier truth. In some kitchens, stale bread was reused as a serving plate called a trencher. You imagine setting down a slab of meat on top of this bread dish, then either eating it afterward or tossing it to the dogs. It is the ultimate medieval version of recycling, as you watch a pot bubbles with what can only be described as sludge. The apprentice stirs with a stick almost taller than himself, muttering about the endless pottage. The stew never really empties. Ingredients are tossed in day after day, sometimes for weeks, until the taste is anyone's guess. Historians still argue whether the flavor of such a dish was comforting or horrifying. Perhaps it depended on the household. To you, it looks like something that could either keep you alive or send you running to the privy. You shiver at the thought of eating it night after night. The room is not just hot, it is noisy. Dogs bark, pots clang, and the crackle of fire mixes with the constant hum of voices. Children run in and out, not because they are hungry, but because the kitchen is the warmest place in a drafty hall. It doubles as living space, gossip hub, and sometimes even bedroom. Imagine trying to sleep while someone hacks at salted pork with an axe on a block beside you. It makes you grateful for the quiet hum of modern appliances. In this space, food is power. Whoever controls the kitchen controls the health of everyone in the manor. yet you feel that power comes with responsibility. The cook is both feared and respected because she knows what herbs to add when the meat smells wrong, and which spices to throw in to mask something past its prime. A small wooden box of peppercorns is treated like treasure, locked and counted. Spices travel thousands of miles from the east, making them more valuable than gold to nobles. You picture this tired woman with soot-streaked cheeks carefully measuring pepper into the pot, aware that her lord upstairs will notice if it is missing. You glance at the walls, where smoked hams hang from hooks and bunches of herbs dry in the rafters.
Not every kitchen has this bounty.
In poorer cottages, food is cooked over a smaller hearth with little more than onions, beans, and a hunk of bread to stretch across the week. But here at least the lords expect variety. You are suddenly aware of how different life is depending on class. For peasants, survival tastes bland. For nobles, survival tastes expensive. Yet the gap is not always as wide as you think. Even a noble's feast is built upon the same bread, ale, and meat that peasants chew, just with more seasoning and ceremony. The cold irony of this kitchen is that, despite the roaring fire, you still feel a chill. Drafts cut through the stone walls, and smoke seeps through cracks, leaving your clothes reeking. You wonder how anyone could eat with so much ash in the air. But people did. They ate with fingers, wiped grease on their tunics, and carried on because hunger does not wait for comfort. You realize that food here is not romance or artistry. It is survival disguised with rituals of roasting, boiling, and baking. And for you, stepping into this kitchen, it feels like the beginning of a long, slow lesson in what it truly meant to eat in the Middle Ages. The smoke drifts low across the rafters, and your eyes follow the cook as she stirs a cauldron the size of a barrel. It gurgles and steams with something thick, bubbling, and not entirely appetizing. This is not soup in the modern sense, light and fresh. It is pottage, the eternal stew of the Middle Ages, the dish that defines daily life more than anything else. You lean closer and see chopped onions, a handful of barley, a turnip sliced roughly, and a bit of pork fat floating on top. The smell is earthy, heavy, slightly sour, and utterly relentless. Everyone eats pottage. It is breakfast, lunch, and dinner all rolled into one. In fact, it is so common that the pot never really empties. Leftovers are saved, new ingredients are thrown in, and the mixture continues day after day, sometimes for weeks. Historians still argue whether the perpetual stew was as unbroken as legend claims, but the idea is not far-fetched. A simmering pot was safer than trying to preserve scraps individually, and it made every contribution, no matter how small, stretch just a little further. You imagine lifting the lid after a week and finding a stew that is equal parts history and mystery. You dip a spoon in and taste barley softened to mush. It is filling but bland. The turnip adds a bitterness that lingers on your tongue. You chew through a sliver of fat that has gone rubbery with too much boiling.
It is food, yes, but it is not joy.
You chuckle at the thought that eternal stew could be marketed today as a trendy rustic dish, when in truth it was mostly desperation in a pot. A mainstream fact is that medieval diets revolved around cereals, and pottage was the primary delivery system. Whether thickened with oats, barley, or wheat if you were lucky, pottage provided the bulk of calories for peasants. A quirky tidbit, though, is that some recipes were surprisingly inventive. Surviving cookbooks show versions with almonds, saffron, and wine, but those were noble tables, not village kitchens. For the average person, the most exotic addition might be a rabbit bone or wild herbs picked from the hedgerows. The fire spits as someone tosses in another log. You hear children whining for more, their wooden bowls already licked clean. Pottage was flexible. It could be made thick and hearty, almost solid, or thin and watery when supplies ran short. Mothers stretched it endlessly, throwing in cabbage stalks, leeks, and even weeds when famine pressed close. Imagine proudly presenting a dish of nettle pottage. Stinging weeds boiled into submission, a green sludge masquerading as dinner. You picture the daily rhythm. waking up cold, ladling out a portion of last night's pottage, chewing it while heading to the fields, then returning hours later to add whatever scraps were caught, grown, or begged for that day. The pot keeps bubbling, always waiting, always hungry. It becomes less a meal and more a symbol of continuity. In its steam, you smell survival, but also exhaustion. Sitting nearby, an old man dips bread into his bowl, soaking the crust until it softens. This trick is universal, using hard bread to give body to otherwise thin gruel. Trenchers, those bread plates from earlier, often ended their lives this way, dissolving into the stew. You cannot help but smile at the idea of a bowl that eats itself, as if the food was impatient to be devoured. The cook leans close and explains that pottage was not always miserable. In harvest time, with vegetables fresh and plentiful, it could be colourful and even cheerful. Carrots, peas, beans and leeks might mingle together, fragrant with herbs like parsley or thyme. In winter, though, it shrinks back to monotony. Turnip, barley, water, repeat. That is when hunger gnaws hardest, when each spoonful feels more like obligation than nourishment. You laugh softly at the thought of eternal stew as a communal diary. Every ingredient tells a story: the chicken bone from Sunday, the mushroom gathered in the woods, the cabbage leaf your neighbour traded for a favour. The pot is a memory you can taste, whether you want to or not. As you slurp the thick broth, your teeth crunch unexpectedly on a small pebble. The grindstones that mill grain are unforgiving. You rub your tongue along your teeth and realize again how many medieval mouths were wrecked by their food itself. Chewing becomes a gamble between nourishment and damage. Children hover close, their faces smeared with pottage, eyes wide with both hunger and boredom. You recognize the paradox. This food keeps them alive, yet it is also the taste of every dull day they will remember. Adults joke about pottage again, the way modern people complain about leftover pasta. You grin at the shared human instinct to complain about the food that sustains us. In noble halls, pottage takes on new form. It becomes a delicacy, thickened with almonds, sweetened with honey, coloured with saffron. Spices like cinnamon and ginger turn the dish into something closer to pudding. The peasants below gnaw turnip mash, while their lords above spoon almond milk stew. Same concept, different world. You sigh, realizing food is never just food, it is status in a bowl. The night draws colder. Steam coils upward, fragrant and persistent, carrying with it centuries of survival. You dip again, swallow, and feel warmth creep into your chest. For all its flaws, pottage does its job. It fills, it sustains, it pushes one more day forward. You would not last a week eating this endlessly, but for them, it is life. The eternal stew never stops. The fire continues to spit and hiss, but now your eyes drift toward the great wooden table where bread loaves are cooling. They are not soft white rolls like you imagine from a bakery. Instead, these are dense, heavy discs of rye and barley, dark in colour and slightly cracked on the surface. One loaf is so hard that you suspect it could be used as a weapon. This is the reality of daily sustenance. Bread is not a treat. It is the foundation of life. Without it, you would feel empty all day. And yet, as you look closer, you realize even bread carries its own hazards. Bits of stone and grit from grinding mills often end up in the flour. Over time, those tiny grains wear down teeth until mouths are ragged stumps. Imagine smiling with half your molars gone before you turn 30. That is the price of eating bread every day. Next to the bread sits a barrel of ale. Not the frothy pint you picture clinking in a tavern, but a weak, watery brew known as small ale. Everyone drinks it, from peasants to children, not for celebration, but for safety. Water itself is suspicious. Wells can be fouled, rivers run with waste, and clean springs are rare treasures. So you drink ale even if it tastes flat and sour. It has just enough alcohol to kill off bacteria, but not enough to make you stagger through your chores. Still, you cannot help but chuckle at the thought of a medieval toddler sipping ale at breakfast while their parents nod approvingly. It sounds scandalous to you, but to them it is common sense. Historians still argue whether diets in the Middle Ages were as monotonous as they seem, or whether people enjoyed more variety than we assume. Certainly peasants often ate the same thing day after day: bread, pottage, ale. Yet small luxuries did appear. A rabbit snared in the hedgerow, a basket of berries, or a fish pulled from a stream could brighten a dreary week. You imagine the excitement of stumbling upon honey from a wild hive, sticky sweetness dripping from your fingers. In a world where sugar is nearly unknown, honey feels like liquid gold. A mainstream fact is that in many places laws regulated what kinds of bread could be sold. The assize of bread, established in England, tied the price of bread to the cost of grain. Bakers who cheated customers by making loaves too small risked punishment as harsh as being dragged through town on a sled with their false bread hung around their neck. A quirky tidbit, though, is that some bakers deliberately added beans, peas, or even ground up fava stalks into the flour to stretch it further. It was cheaper, but it gave bread a greenish tint and a taste that no one really wanted. As you lean against the table, you notice a trencher, a thick slice of yesterday's bread, being used as a plate.
A slab of roasted meat rests on it, soaking grease into the crust.
After the meal, the trencher might be eaten, or more often tossed to dogs or beggars.
Nothing is wasted.
You cannot help but think it is both efficient and depressing. Imagine asking for a plate today and being handed a piece of stale bread. That would be the medieval equivalent of fine dining. The room grows warmer as more food is prepared, but hunger here is relentless. Peasants often consumed thousands of calories just to keep up with hard labor in the fields, yet they still felt hollow by evening. The bread fills your stomach but does not linger. The ale quenches thirst but leaves you craving sweetness. The constant gnawing hunger is part of life, gnawing in rhythm with the tolling of church bells that divide each day. The servants gossip about their lords who sit in the great hall expecting their own meals soon.
Nobles may enjoy roasted swan, venison in spicy sauce, or lampreys cooked in wine, but even their feasts are not guaranteed to satisfy.
Without refrigeration, meat spoils quickly and heavy spices often hide the taste of rot. You picture a baron boasting about his feast while quietly chewing meat that smells slightly wrong. Luxury here is a strange thing. It glitters, but only from a distance. The cook reaches into a sack and pulls out a handful of beans, tossing them into the bubbling cauldron. Beans and peas are known as pulse, and they are the silent heroes of survival. They store well, they are cheap, and they bulk up any stew, yet they also carry an awkward reputation. Eating too many leads to bloating and discomfort, and in a world without proper ventilation, you can imagine how quickly a crowded hall becomes unpleasant after a bean-heavy meal. You smile, realizing some medieval complaints sound suspiciously modern. The hearth hisses as another log is thrown on, sparks shooting into the rafters. Smoke curls around the hams hanging above, a reminder that preservation is as important as flavor. Meat is salted, smoked, or dried because fresh meat is a rare luxury. Even nobles eat salted pork more often than delicate roasts. You chew on the thought that the taste of fresh is something most people in this world never know. The floor beneath you is sticky with spilled ale and grease. Dogs lap it eagerly, wagging their tails, knowing this is the best chance they will have for scraps. Cats slink in, eyes bright, waiting for a rat to dart from the shadows. Vermin are constant companions, another reminder that food must be guarded as much from animals as from hunger. The kitchen feels less like a place of comfort and more like a battlefield where survival is fought with ladles, knives, and patience. You sip from a wooden cup of ale, grimacing at the sourness. Still, as it warms your throat, you realize it is not terrible. It is steady, reliable like the bread at your side. Together they form the backbone of this society. Bread and ale are not luxuries, but they are essential. Without them, nothing else matters. And as the cook wipes her brow and mutters about the endless dough to knead, you feel the weight of that truth settle over you. You would not last a day here, not with this hunger, this monotony, this endless need to chew through another loaf of gritty bread while sipping ale that tastes like faint vinegar. Yet for them it is life. And so you sit, crumbs on your lap, the rhythm of medieval survival pressing forward with each bite. The fire crackles lower now, its glow casting long shadows across the rough stone walls. Your eyes drift to a butcher's table where salted slabs of pork lie stacked like bricks. A sharp smell stings your nose, half salt, half rot. This is meat in the Middle Ages, not fresh, tender and clean, but preserved, rough and suspicious. You might expect meat to be the crown jewel of any meal, but here it is more of a gamble than a treat. For peasants, meat is rare, a prize saved for holidays, feasts, or unexpected windfalls. Most of the year you live on bread, ale and pottage. But when meat does arrive, it is often salted or smoked to extend its life. Salting draws the moisture out, but it leaves behind a chewiness that feels more like gnawing leather than savouring food. Smoking coats each bite with acrid notes of ash. It fills your belly, yes, but it also leaves you thirsty, reaching for more ale to wash away the salt. On the Lord's table, meat is far more common. Deer, boar and swan arrive roasted with pomp and spectacle. Yet even here appearances deceive. Without refrigeration, meat begins to turn quickly, especially in summer. Historians still argue whether spices were used primarily to flavour or simply to mask decay, but there is little doubt that a medieval noble might be feasting on venison that was already well past its prime. Imagine a hall full of candlelight and music, while servants present a grand boar's head, its mouth stuffed with apples to disguise the smell of age. You take a slice of salted pork and chew. It is dense, gritty with crystallized salt, and tough enough to tire your jaw. A joke slips into your mind. Medieval dentistry may have been primitive, but at least the meat itself helped with tooth extractions. A mainstream fact is that laws sometimes restricted hunting. In England, royal forests were protected by harsh regulations. Only nobles and the king's men could take game like deer or wild boar. To be caught poaching could mean mutilation or death. Yet a quirky tidbit is that people still risked it. A rabbit from the forest or a pigeon snared on the sly could mean protein for a hungry family, worth the danger of punishment. The kitchen smells of smoke and fat as skewers turn slowly above the flames. Chickens are strung up on iron spits, dripping grease into the coals. A boy crouches nearby, catching the fat in a pan to baste the birds. Even small birds like doves or sparrows are eaten, bones and all when times grow desperate. You picture chewing through a roasted sparrow, cracking bones between your teeth, marrow squirting like an uninvited guest. Not pleasant, but better than starving. At sea or near rivers, fish takes the place of meat. But tonight, in this smoky hall, it is the meat of land animals that dominates. The smell is thick, metallic, and primal. Nobles carve portions with daggers, passing hunks onto trenchers of bread. Peasants in the corner wait hopefully for scraps, knowing even the bones have value for broth. Dogs lurk beneath the table, snarling softly as they wait for their turn. The scene is both feast and frenzy, abundance and waste side by side. You pause to consider how class shapes taste. To the poor, meat is aspiration. To the rich, it is display. Nobles show their wealth not by having bread, which everyone eats, but by having fresh venison and exotic birds. In fact, some feasts serve animals more for spectacle than flavour. Peacocks, for example, are cooked and then redressed in their own feathers for a theatrical entrance. The taste is reportedly awful, stringy, greasy and bland, but no one cares. It is a performance, a show of power. You laugh quietly, realizing medieval fine dining sometimes resembled a bad cooking show, more flash than flavor. The fire pops, sending sparks upward. The salted pork still sits heavily in your stomach. You think about famine years when even bad meat was better than none. People resorted to eating horse, dog, or whatever could be scavenged. Chroniclers wrote grimly of cannibalism during sieges, though those accounts are often exaggerated to shock readers. Still, the fear of running out of meat and what came next was very real. As the hall grows louder, you watch servants carve ribs from a boar. The fat glistens, the smell strong enough to choke. Yet nobles cheer, tearing into the meat with greasy fingers. Etiquette says use your knife, but hunger says otherwise. You sip ale to steady yourself, both amused and repelled. The truth settles slowly. Meat is not a delicacy here. It is a challenge. It is salty, smoky, and sometimes rancid. It is the taste of privilege for nobles and a distant dream for peasants. And as you push the last bite of pork into your mouth, chewing through gristle with weary determination, you admit one simple truth. You would not last a day eating this. Not without strong teeth, endless ale, and a tolerance for flavors that cling like shadows long after the feast is done. The hall grows quieter as the last of the meat is cleared away. What remains on the tables is far more familiar to every medieval stomach: bread and pottage. These two humble staples are the true backbone of daily life, as constant as the tolling of church bells or the chill that creeps through your bones at dawn. You would think bread is a simple thing, but here it is both survival and a social marker. The peasant's bread is coarse and heavy, often made with rye, oats, or barley, rather than fine white wheat. It is dark in colour, dense in texture, and sprinkled with the occasional pebble of grit from millstones that wore down into the flour. Take a bite, and you grind your teeth against unexpected crunch. No wonder dental records from medieval skeletons show worn enamel. Every meal was like chewing gravel. For the nobility, though, bread becomes a status symbol. The whitest, finest wheat is sifted and baked into loaves called manchet, soft and light compared to the slabs of black rye that peasants pull from the hearth. Bread is not just food here, it is hierarchy in baked form. You tear off a piece and imagine the warmth of a communal oven. Villages often shared one, each family placing their loaves into the same heat, marked with symbols carved into the dough. Historians still argue whether some villages enforced strict turns or whether the ovens were more casual, but either way, the oven became as much a social gathering place as the tavern. One quirky fact is that some bread was stretched with fillers like acorns, beans, or even ground-up tree bark during years of poor harvests. Imagine biting into bark bread, its bitterness sticking in your mouth. It filled the belly, yes, but joy was in short supply. Beside the bread sits the steaming pot of pottage, a thick stew that changes daily, or rather, changes whenever new ingredients are thrown in. It begins with water, a handful of grains, and whatever vegetables or scraps are available. Sometimes it simmers for days, each meal ladled from the same bubbling pot, with new odds and ends tossed in as they appear. You lean close and smell cabbage, leeks, and maybe a scrap of bacon bone that adds a faint, smoky note. The texture is mushy, the flavour earthy, but the warmth spreads through your chest as you sip. It is not glamorous, but it keeps you alive. The wealthier you are, the richer your pottage. Nobles toss in beef, spices, or imported raisins. Peasants stir in beans, peas, and wild greens. The gap between the two bowls is the same as the gap between their lives, one padded with richness, the other stretched thin. But even among the poor, pottage can be flavoured with herbs gathered from fields, parsley, sage, or sorrel, lending a brightness that cuts through the heaviness. You think of it as a medieval version of leftovers stew, never the same twice, never entirely finished, always slightly better the day after. A boy sits nearby, breaking stale bread into chunks to thicken the broth. Trenchers, too, play their part here. A trencher is a flat piece of bread used as both plate and sponge. After a meal, the trencher soaks up gravy and broth, turning into a soggy, edible dish. Sometimes trenchers are given to the poor or to dogs, sometimes eaten by the diners themselves. Either way, nothing goes to waste. You picture modern food critics shuddering at the thought of eating plate bread, but for medieval folk, it is practical genius. The pottage bubbles, spitting gently as a woman stirs with a wooden ladle. You imagine the long hours she spends preparing it, the smoke in her eyes, the ache in her shoulders. Food here is work as much as nourishment, and yet there is a kind of comfort in the ritual. The bread rises, the pottage thickens, the family gathers. Hunger is held at bay, at least for today. A mainstream fact is that pottage endured for centuries, from early medieval huts to Tudor kitchens, outlasting fashions in meat, sweets and sauces. It was the constant hum beneath all the feasts and famines, a quirky tidbit. Some households made a special pottage called frumenti, a celebratory dish of boiled wheat, milk and eggs, sometimes sweetened with honey. It appeared on festival days, especially at Christmas, turning the everyday porridge into a rare delight. As you sip your bowl of cabbage-thickened broth, you realize that survival here is not about indulgence, but about patience. Bread that tests your teeth, pottage that never truly ends. Day after day, the same humble flavors return, as steady as the rhythm of footsteps on a dirt road. It may be boring, but boring is better than starving. You swallow, wipe your mouth with the back of your hand, and accept what medieval life already knows. This is the taste of survival, the taste you would not last a day without. The hall darkens as the fire sinks low, and a monk's bell echoes faintly outside. Its chime is a reminder of another truth that shapes your plate. Religion dictates what you eat and when. The church calendar is dotted with fast days, feast days, and holy days, each carrying rules that would baffle your modern appetite. Most of all, there is the prohibition against meat on Fridays, during Lent, and on countless other occasions scattered through the year. That means fish, whether you like it or not. Picture a long wooden table in a monastery, each monk bowing his head over a bowl of steaming fish stew. The smell is pungent, oily, and sharp, filling the air like a stubborn guest who refuses to leave. For peasants, fish might mean eels pulled from muddy rivers, or salted herring shipped from the coast in barrels. For nobles, fish is a chance to display wealth, with delicacies like sturgeon, pike, or lampreys served in elaborate sauces. Lampreys, long and slimy like living leather belts, were so prized that King Henry the Bull of England reportedly died from eating too many of them. Historians still argue whether the story is true or simply slander, but the image of a king undone by slimy fish lingers like a bad aftertaste. You take a bite of salted herring. The flesh is dry, flaky, and briny enough to make your lips pucker. It feels less like food and more like something preserved for eternity, yet it was the backbone of medieval fasting diets. Whole industries sprang up around supplying herring to inland towns. Quirky detail, some towns in northern Europe grew so rich on herring that their entire economy rested on barrels of fish, as though wealth itself swam upstream each season. Closer to rivers, eels became common. They were easy to trap, wriggling into woven baskets left in the water overnight. You picture a villager pulling up a basket full of eels, their bodies twisting and glistening, and you shudder. But when fried or stewed, they provided needed fat in a diet otherwise heavy on grains. Even monasteries kept eel ponds, a slimy but practical insurance against hunger. For nobles, fish was also a canvas for display. Whole salmon were roasted, decorated with herbs, and presented with ceremony. Sometimes cooks disguised fish as other meats, shaping pike into mock venison or covering eels in sauces thick enough to fool the eye. The kitchen became a stage, with deception as part of the performance. You laugh quietly at the thought of medieval food pranks where the punchline was simply, "Surprise, it is fish." In coastal towns, markets bustled with dried cod, smoked haddock, and shellfish. Mussels and oysters were common, so plentiful they were considered poor man's fare rather than delicacies. Imagine the surprise of a medieval fisherman if you told him that oysters would one day be luxury dining in chic restaurants. He would probably laugh, then sell you a bucket for a few pennies, a mainstream fact. During Lent, when meat was forbidden for 40 days, fish demand skyrocketed. This created a thriving trade that connected distant ports and inland villages, ensuring fish became a central part of the medieval economy. But a quirky tidbit, sometimes fasting rules stretched into strange territory. Beavers, for instance, were classified as fish by the church because their tails were thought to be scaly. That meant you could eat beaver on Fridays without sin. Imagine explaining that to your dinner companions as you gnaw on a tail. The taste of fish lingers in your mouth and you wash it down with ale. It strikes you that medieval food is not only about hunger or class, but also about faith. You eat what the church allows when the church allows it. Your stomach is a disciple, bending to the rhythm of bells and fasts.
On feast days you gorge.
On fast days, you chew salted herring until your jaw aches. Either way, the balance between body and soul is enforced through your plate. As the monk's bell fades, you set aside the bony remains of your fish and sigh. It fills you, yes, but the taste is heavy, oily, and monotonous. You would not last a day if forced to eat this every Friday, every Lent, every holy day, year after year. Yet for medieval people, fish was not just survival, it was salvation in salted form. And that perhaps is the strangest flavour of all. The hearth glows faintly, embers cracking, while a dairy maid hurries in with a wooden bucket sloshing with fresh milk. She sets it down and immediately you sense that this bucket carries both promise and danger. In the medieval world, milk is a tricky friend. Without refrigeration, it turns sour quickly, curdling in the heat, thickening in the cold. Drink it fresh if you can. But more often it is transformed into something else. Cheese, butter, or a sharp, sour drink that makes your stomach twist. You lean closer as the dairymaid stirs a pot of milk over low heat. Rennet, an enzyme from a calf's stomach, is added, and suddenly the liquid clumps into curds and whey. The sight is strange, almost alchemical. This is how cheese is born, from accident and necessity. A mainstream fact is that cheese-making goes back thousands of years, but in medieval Europe it becomes essential. Hard cheeses can last through winter, soft ones provide daily nourishment, and all of them give a valuable source of protein and fat when meat is scarce. You bite into a chunk of fresh cheese. It is tangy, crumbly, and slightly sour, nothing like the refined wheels stacked in modern delis.
Still it fills you.
Farmer's cheese, made simply from soured milk, was common fare. Nobles, on the other hand, prized imported varieties like Parmesan, already famous by the late Middle Ages. Imagine a medieval lord sprinkling shaved Parmesan over a dish of pottage, showing off not only his wealth, but his international connections. Nearby, a woman churns butter. She grips the dasher, pounding rhythmically into the cream, her arms aching from the effort. Butter, when finally achieved, is golden luxury. Spread it on bread, melt it into pottage, or simply eat it fresh with herbs. Yet butter has its seasons. In Catholic regions, butter is often banned during Lent, forcing people to substitute oil, which was costly inland. Some monasteries even paid special fees called butter allowances to permit its use. You smile at the idea of paperwork filed simply so monks could enjoy buttered bread. Quirky detail: people did not waste the sour milk left behind. Instead, it was drunk as clabber or used to moisten bread. Thick, sour, and not exactly appetizing, it was nonetheless safer than risking spoiled meat. Children grew up with it, farmers relied on it, and travelers carried it. You sip from a wooden cup and grimace. The taste is sharp, acidic, and leaves your tongue coated. You cannot help but chuckle. It feels less like a drink and more like a dare. Historians still argue how widely milk was consumed by adults. Some suggest lactose intolerance limited its use, while others argue that souring and fermenting made it digestible enough. Either way, dairy carved out its place in the medieval kitchen, especially in rural communities where cows, sheep, and goats grazed. Sheep's milk was richer, goat's milk more common in rocky lands, cow's milk prized in fertile valleys. In noble kitchens, dairy takes on more refinement. Cream sauces appear in cookbooks flavored with sugar or spices for desserts. Custards, tarts, and cheese pies decorate banquet tables, transforming humble milk into sophisticated dishes. Yet in cottages, dairy remains practical. Butter is wrapped in leaves and tucked into cellars. Cheese wheels are stored on shelves, and sour milk is gulped before it spoils. You picture a winter evening. Outside, snow falls silently. Inside, a family huddles by the hearth, tearing chunks of coarse bread and dipping them into melted butter. The warmth spreads, bellies fill, and for a moment, hunger loosens its grip. In another house, poorer and colder, a woman pours sour milk into a bowl, stirring it with stale bread for her children. Both meals are made from the same source, yet the taste and comfort could not be more different. The dairymaid wipes her hands on her apron, sighing with fatigue. She knows milk is a fickle companion, rewarding one day, punishing the next. You taste the tang of cheese still on your tongue, the faint sweetness of butter, the sting of sour milk. It is survival disguised in many forms, but none of it feels glamorous. You think to yourself, you would not last a day in a world where your breakfast could sour before you finish your chores. And yet, for them, this cycle of milk, curd, butter, and whey is simply life, harsh, uncertain, and always a little sour. The morning mist hangs heavy outside, but in the courtyard you hear the first call of a rooster, strutting proudly as if he owns the entire village. Chickens scatter at your feet, scratching at the dirt, pecking at scraps tossed from the kitchen. This is the soundtrack of medieval life, clucks, squawks, and the occasional angry flutter when a bird is grabbed for the pot. Poultry is everywhere, noisy companions as essential as bread and ale. You watch a woman lift the wooden lid of a woven basket. Inside are eggs, pale brown and speckled, some still warm from the hen.
Eggs are treasures here.
They can be eaten fried on a flat iron, boiled in their shells, or beaten into pottage to thicken it. They are cheap protein, small but mighty. A mainstream fact. In many monasteries, rules allowed only a limited number of eggs during fasting periods. Yet loopholes always appeared. Monks found clever ways to classify eggs differently or count them separately from meat, proving once again that even in matters of faith, appetite finds its path. You crack one open into a pan. The yolk is rich, orange, and thick, sliding slowly onto the iron plate. The smell is comforting, warm, and familiar, even across centuries. You take a bite, simple, hearty, filling. It tastes like survival with a touch of luxury. Eggs were not eaten daily by peasants, but when they appeared, they brought both nourishment and relief from monotony. Nearby, a boy chases a chicken, tripping in the mud as feathers fly. Catching a bird for dinner is less elegant than you imagine. Squawking, clawing, flapping, the scene is a small battle before the real meal begins.
Once caught, the bird is plucked over the fire, its down drifting into the air like grey snow.
The meat is lean, sometimes tough, but every part is used. The carcass becomes stew, the bones flavour broth, the feet boiled into gelatinous soup. Waste is unthinkable when hunger waits around every corner. Quirky tidbit. Not every bird you see in a medieval yard is destined for the table. Some chickens are bred for cockfighting, a grim but popular entertainment. Feathers fly in contests that draw cheers and wagers. The birds themselves suffer, but for villagers, it is sport and distraction. You cannot help but shake your head. imagining the same rooster crowing proudly in the morning and fighting for his life by afternoon. Historians still argue about how widely poultry was consumed compared to larger livestock. Cows and sheep were valuable for milk and wool, so slaughtering them casually made little sense. Chickens, on the other hand, reproduced quickly and required little space. That made them perfect for feeding families in cramped villages. Ducks, geese, and pigeons also appeared on the menu, though each carried its own symbolism. Geese were associated with prosperity, doves with peace, pigeons with humble resourcefulness. You watch as a woman carefully gathers eggs into her apron. She sets aside some for eating, others for hatching. The delicate balance between consuming today and saving for tomorrow shapes her every choice. Break too many eggs for food now and you lose tomorrow's flock. Restrain too much and hunger sharpens its teeth. It is a constant gamble, one you feel even as you hold a warm egg in your palm. At the Lord's Manor, poultry takes on a different face. Nobles feast on capons, castrated roosters fattened for tender meat, or elaborate pies filled with quail and pheasant. Some banquets disguise small birds inside larger ones, a culinary trick meant to surprise guests. Imagine cutting into a roasted goose only to find doves spilling out like feathery treasure. It is theatre on a plate, equal parts wonder and absurdity. You smile at the sheer extravagance of it, knowing peasants outside would give thanks for a single boiled egg. The courtyard smells of straw, droppings and wood smoke. It is messy, noisy and alive. Chickens strut between your legs as if daring you to try catching them.
A woman scolds the boy for dropping an egg, the yolk oozing into the dirt.
Every loss stings when resources are fragile. You realize how much daily survival depends on these small,
feathered creatures, how their noise, their eggs,
their meat shape the rhythm of the day. You take another bite of your fried egg, the warmth spreading in your chest. For all its simplicity, it feels comforting. And yet, you know the effort behind it. The mud, the squawking, the risk of losing tomorrow's flock. You sigh, amused but humbled. You would not last a day in a barnyard where every egg is a decision, every bird a battle, and every meal a reminder that survival is feathered, noisy, and never guaranteed. The orchard path leads you back toward the garden, where rows of vegetables sit low in the soil, their leaves nodding in the breeze. This is not the neat, manicured kitchen garden you might imagine. It is rough, crowded, and muddy, with weeds sprouting between the crops. Yet here lies the real foundation of daily survival. You crouch down and tug at a leek, its long white stalk slick with dirt. The smell is sharp, oniony, clinging to your hands even after you wipe them on your tunic. A mainstream fact, medieval diets leaned heavily on vegetables, especially for peasants. Root crops like turnips, parsnips, and onions provided bulk in calories. Cabbage and leeks became staples, boiled into pottage or fried in lard when it was available. Without these humble plants, bread alone would not have been enough to sustain long days in the fields. A quirky tidbit. Some people believed cabbages had medicinal powers, able to cure headaches, stomach aches, and even protect against drunkenness. Imagine clutching a boiled cabbage leaf to your forehead after too much ale. It sounds ridiculous, but people swore by it. You pull a turnip from the ground, its bulb rough and misshapen. Bite into it raw, and the flavor is sharp and earthy, almost bitter. Cook it in stew, and it softens into something more palatable, though still not exactly delightful. Onions, too, dominate every pot. Their smell fills cottages. Their taste masks the blandness of grains. It is no wonder that onion patches became as important as bread ovens in villages. Spinach and kale, less glamorous than modern salads, were boiled down until they became mush, more medicine than meal. You imagine a bowl of bitter greens with no salt, no seasoning, just limp leaves floating in water.
It is enough to make you wince.
Yet these greens brought vital vitamins, preventing sickness in ways people did not fully understand. Historians still argue how much nutritional awareness medieval folk had, but they clearly knew that vegetables kept bellies full and bodies strong. The air in the garden is heavy with the scent of herbs. Parsley, dill, and sage grow in clusters, not for garnish, but for necessity. These herbs lift bland pottage into something tolerable, sometimes even pleasant. Sorrel adds a sour bite, mint a sharp freshness, garlic a fiery kick. Without these, the monotony of grains and roots might have broken spirits as much as bodies. In noble gardens, vegetables hold less glamour. Nobles prefer meat, fish, and exotic imports. Vegetables are seen as poor man's fare, filling but unworthy of feasts. Yet even lords rely on them when fasting or during lean years, and monks with their cloister gardens elevate vegetables into daily staples, tending neat rows of beans and onions behind stone walls. Their gardens become laboratories of survival, places where knowledge of planting and preserving quietly grows. Quirky detail. Leeks held special cultural pride in Wales, worn as emblems in battle and sung about in poetry. Imagine soldiers with leeks pinned to their tunics, proud of a vegetable that most people boiled into soup. It is both humorous and oddly touching, a reminder that even the humblest food can become a symbol of identity. You kneel by the cabbage patch, plucking limp leaves and tossing them into a basket. The smell is sulphurous, pungent, not exactly appetizing. You picture peasants eating cabbage day after day, their breath sharp enough to fill a hall. Yet this smell means survival, especially in the hungry gap. The bleak months in spring when winter stores run low and new harvests have not yet ripened. As evening falls, smoke rises from nearby cottages. Each hearth bubbles with pots filled with roots and greens, boiling into the endless pottage. Children wrinkle their noses, men slurp hungrily, women sigh at the repetition. It is not glamorous, but it is steady. Food that grows from dirt is food that keeps you alive. You take a bite of boiled leek, soft and pungent, the flavor clinging stubbornly to your tongue. You swallow, your stomach warmed, but your taste buds unimpressed. And yet you understand. In a world where meat is rare, bread is hard, and fruit is fleeting, vegetables are the quiet heroes. You smile wry and tired. You would not last a day chewing bitter greens without complaint. But for medieval people, this was life, earthy, pungent, and grown straight from the soil at their feet. The barnyard fades behind you, and now you step into the edges of an orchard, the air crisp with the scent of earth and grass. In the Middle Ages, fruit is not an everyday indulgence, but a seasonal gift. You reach for an apple dangling from a low branch.
Its skin is mottled, rough, and smaller than the perfect supermarket apples you know.
You bite into it and the flesh is tart, almost sour, the juice dripping down your chin. This is sweetness in a world where sugar is a luxury few ever taste. A mainstream fact is that apples, pears, and plums were common across medieval Europe, eaten fresh when in season or dried for winter. Orchards were valuable not only for food, but for the cider and perry pressed from their fruits. A quirky tidbit: medieval pears were often so hard that they had to be cooked in wine or honey before being edible. Imagine cracking your teeth on a raw pear, then deciding it might be better as stew. Berries line the hedgerows, blackberries, raspberries, sloes. Children gather them in woven baskets, their lips stained purple. For peasants, these fruits are free food, scattered by nature's hand. But they are fleeting, gone once the season passes. You picture the joy of stumbling upon wild strawberries in the summer, tiny, fragrant, and vanishingly rare. One handful would feel like treasure. You stop to watch a farmer's wife slice apples thin and lay them on wooden racks to dry in the sun. Without refrigeration, preservation is everything. Dried apples may be leathery and tough, but they keep for months, a sweet bite in the bleak heart of winter. In monasteries, monks carefully stored dried figs and dates brought by trade routes, exotic fruits that tasted like distant lands. You grin at the thought of a monk quietly savouring a fig, while outside peasants chewed stale bread. Historians still argue whether medieval diets were as fruit-poor as they appear. Some records suggest peasants had regular access to orchard fruits, while others point to shortages and seasonal limitations. Truth is likely uneven. Some regions flourished with apples and cherries, others struggled with little more than nuts and berries. What is certain is that fruit was never taken for granted. It was fleeting, perishable, and all the more precious because of it. Nobles dined on fruits candied in honey or preserved in syrup, sometimes arranged in elaborate displays at banquets. Oranges, lemons, and pomegranates appeared on the wealthiest tables, imported at staggering cost. The sight of a golden orange would have shocked a peasant, who might live their entire life never seeing such brightness. Yet even among nobles, fruit was rare enough to be considered a statement, a shining jewel among salted meats and coarse breads. Quirky detail. In some parts of Europe, fruit was baked into pies not as desserts but as hearty meals. Apple pies seasoned with pepper, pear tarts with saffron, and plum puddings filled the gap between savoury and sweet. Spices disguised imperfections, sugar was absent, and the results were both strange and strangely satisfying. You imagine sitting at a table, biting into a pie that tastes half fruity, half fiery, and deciding it is better than another bowl of pottage. Children climb trees, their laughter mixing with birdsong, plucking cherries and stuffing them into their mouths until juice stains their clothes. The scene is almost timeless, a reminder that fruit is not only food but joy. For peasants, these moments are fleeting sparks in a diet dominated by grains. For nobles, fruit is a symbol of refinement, imported delicacies that whisper of far-off lands. As you finish your apple, the tartness lingers on your tongue. You realize fruit here is not just about taste, it is about time. It teaches patience, reward, and loss. Miss the season, and you wait another year? Harvest too much, and it rots before your eyes. Every bite is a balance between indulgence and waste. You sigh, amused at how something so ordinary to you is so extraordinary to them. You would not last a day in this world where fruit is fleeting treasure, each apple a gift, each berry a celebration. But for medieval people, that very rarity made it sweeter, a reminder that life's smallest pleasures often grow wild, waiting to be found at the edge of a field. The kitchen is quiet again, but the smell of yeast and damp grain drifts from a side room where barrels line the walls. You step inside and find a brewer stirring a vat of mash, the thick mixture of water and malted grain bubbling with heat. The steam smells faintly sweet, earthy, and sour all at once. This is where ale is born, not bottled, sparkling, or refined, but cloudy, hearty, and brewed in great batches to keep a household alive. Ale is not a luxury here. It is the daily drink consumed by everyone, including children. Water is too risky, easily spoiled by waste and runoff. Ale, with its mild alcohol content, kills bacteria and provides calories. A mainstream fact is that small ale, a weaker version with barely more alcohol than modern kombucha, was consumed all day. It quenched thirst without muddling the head, making it safer than any stream or well. A quirky tidbit. Some records describe people drinking a gallon or more per day, which sounds outrageous until you realize it replaced water entirely. You take a wooden mug and sip. The liquid is murky, slightly warm, with a flavor halfway between sour bread and wet straw. It is not pleasant, but it is safe. It fills your belly and keeps your mouth wet, which is more important than taste. Children gulp it down at breakfast. Men drink it in the fields. Women sip it as they knead bread. Life here runs on ale the way modern life runs on electricity. Unseen, constant, indispensable, beer flavored with hops. Appears later in medieval Europe, especially in regions like the Low Countries and Germany. Hops preserve the drink longer, adding a bitter edge that feels strange at first, but soon becomes beloved. Historians still argue when exactly beer overtook ale in popularity, but the spread of hopped brewing changed everything. Suddenly, barrels could be transported farther, stored longer, and even exported. Beer became commerce, not just survival. In noble halls, stronger ales and wines dominated, but ale remained essential even there. Large households brewed constantly, sometimes employing entire teams of servants to keep the barrels full. Brew houses hummed with activity, boiling mash, straining wort, cooling it in shallow trays, and fermenting it in oak casks. The process is both scientific and chaotic, dependent on weather, yeast in the air, and luck. Sometimes the result is drinkable. Sometimes it sours into vinegar. People drink it anyway. Quirky detail, alewives, women who brewed at home, became such a common sight that laws were written to regulate them. They often hung a broom outside their door to signal fresh ale for sale. Over time, this symbol turned into the image of a witch's broomstick, blending the practical with the mythical. You smile at the idea that a humble sign for cheap ale might echo centuries later in Halloween decorations. The tavern, too, becomes central to village life. Imagine stepping inside a smoky wooden building, benches packed, mugs sloshing, dogs barking underfoot. Ale is poured, stories are traded, wagers made. For peasants, taverns are both escape and necessity. A place to drink, yes, but also to gather news, make deals, and share grievances. The air smells of sweat, spilled ale and smoke, a heady blend of relief and routine. You sip again, grimacing at the sour tang, and think about how constant this flavour must have been.
Every day, with every meal, the same drink.
Sometimes weak, sometimes strong, sometimes bordering on undrinkable, but always there. You chuckle at the thought. Imagine living in a world where even children stumble around after too much ale at breakfast. Though in truth the drink was so weak that drunkenness was rare. As the brewer lifts another bucket into the vat, you realize this drink is more than liquid. It is social glue. It fills your stomach, keeps you alive, and binds the community. To refuse ale would be to refuse life itself. You would not last a day without it, not here, where water is feared and ale is the lifeblood of survival. The mug empties, leaving a yeasty aftertaste in your mouth. You set it down, wipe your lips, and sigh. It may not be fine wine or sparkling cider, but in the Middle Ages, ale is the taste of safety. Bitter, cloudy, and ever-present, it carries the same weight as bread. Another reminder that survival here is not about pleasure, but persistence. The smell of ale still lingers in your mouth as you step into the Lord's Hall, where the clamour is gentler, the air perfumed not by barley mash, but by spiced wines. Here, wine is poured into goblets of pewter or silver, gleaming in candlelight, a symbol as much as a drink. Unlike ale, which fills every cottage, wine is a privilege, a reminder of wealth, trade, and power. You lift a goblet, and the liquid within shines faintly red, catching the flicker of torches. A mainstream fact: wine was common in southern Europe, where vineyards flourished in France, Italy, and Spain. There, it was everyday sustenance, as ale was in the north. But in England, Germany, or Scandinavia, wine had to be imported, and that made it expensive. To sip wine in a northern court was to show connections, money, and sophistication. A quirky tidbit: records show that when England lost its French territories during the 100 Years' War, wine imports dwindled and nobles complained bitterly. Imagine a lord sighing not over lost land but over the absence of his Bordeaux. You take a sip. The taste is sour, rough, not the polished refinement you imagine from modern bottles. Medieval wines were often thin, unaged, and quick to spoil. To make them palatable, people mixed them with honey, spices, or herbs. Hippocras, a spiced wine, was popular at banquets, flavoured with cinnamon, ginger, and sugar if available. It was as much medicine as pleasure, thought to warm the body and cheer the spirit. You picture nobles lifting goblets, praising the drink's virtues while discreetly masking its flaws. Historians still argue how widespread wine consumption truly was outside noble circles. Some monasteries produced wine for liturgical use, ensuring at least the priests had steady access. In towns, merchants imported barrels for wealthy burghers who flaunted their prosperity with a taste of foreign vineyards. For peasants, though, wine was almost mythical, a drink they might glimpse at a wedding feast or hear about in sermons, but rarely taste. Quirky detail: water mixed with wine was considered healthier than water alone. Children in noble households sometimes drank watered wine, just as peasant children drank watered ale. Both were safer than streams, though one clearly carried more prestige. You smile at the irony. The wealthy watered their wine, while the poor watered their ale, each claiming safety, each reminding themselves of their place in the order of things. You glance around the hall. The goblets gleam, but the floor is sticky with spilled drink. Nobles laugh loudly, red wine staining their lips, while musicians play lutes in the corner. Wine fuels merriment, loosens tongues, and oils the gears of diplomacy. Deals are struck over goblets, marriages arranged, feuds softened. Wine is not just drink, it is politics in liquid form. The servant refills your cup, and you notice the sediment swirling in the bottom. Medieval wine is rarely clear. It is cloudy, gritty, often sharp, with vinegar notes if stored too long. You take another sip anyway, letting the warmth spread in your chest. You cannot help but joke this is less fine vintage and more alcoholic grape juice gone wrong. And yet, it is precious. Imported barrels travel by ship and cart, vulnerable to storms, theft, and spoilage. Every swallow carries not only taste, but risk and effort. In monasteries, monks sip wine during Mass, solemnly blessing what peasants call sacred mystery. In palaces, kings raise goblets high, boasting of alliances sealed with a shared barrel. For them, wine is more than drink. It is culture, prestige, and proof of status. You set down your goblet, lips stained faintly red. For a moment you imagine yourself a lord, savouring the luxury. But as the sourness lingers, you realize the truth. Wine here is privilege, but not perfection. It is as flawed as the ale, only dressed in finer clothes. You would not last a day mistaking this sour, spiced brew for modern elegance. And yet for those who drank it, it was worth its weight in gold, the taste of power pressed into every grape. The candles flicker in the great hall, and you notice a small wooden chest being carried to the high table. It is not large, yet the way servants handle it, you would think it was filled with treasure. In a sense, it is. Inside lies salt, the most vital and valuable seasoning of the medieval world. Sprinkle it on meat, stir it into broth, or use it to preserve a hunk of fish. And you understand why people called it white gold, a mainstream fact. Entire economies thrived on salt. Towns built salt works, trade routes carried it across Europe, and wars were fought to control its flow. Without salt, survival was short. With it, food could last through the long, lean winters. A quirky tidbit: in some places, people were actually paid partly in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Imagine your wages clinking not as coins in a purse, but as crystals in a pouch. The Lord sprinkles a pinch on his venison, the tiny grains gleaming in the torchlight. At the other end of the hall, peasants huddle over bowls of bland pottage, rarely tasting salt at all. Its scarcity sharpens the divide between classes. To eat salted meat is privilege. To live without it is drudgery. You lick your lips, realizing how something so simple could hold so much power. But salt is only part of the story. Spices carried from the east along perilous trade routes transformed kitchens into places of wonder. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron, these were the jewels of medieval cooking. Nobles flaunted them shamelessly, showering dishes with more spice than taste required. Roasted bird drowned in cinnamon, why not? A fish stew glowing yellow with saffron, of course. The point was not subtle flavor, but extravagance. You take a bite of peppered beef. The taste is overwhelming, sharp, pungent, enough to make your eyes water. It hides the hint of rot in the meat, yes, but it also burns so fiercely that you wonder if nobles had any sense of moderation. You laugh softly. In their eagerness to show off wealth, medieval lords may have invented the first too much seasoning problem. Historians still argue whether spices were truly used to mask spoiled food or simply to flaunt luxury. Likely it was both. Some meats needed help to pass as edible, but more often, spices were statements of power. After all, peppercorns traveled thousands of miles, carried by caravans across deserts and oceans. To pour them onto a dish was like pouring treasure. Quirky detail, saffron with its golden hue, was so expensive that some merchants were executed for cutting it with fake petals. A pinch of saffron could dye a dish brilliant yellow, transforming humble porridge into what looked like noble fare. You imagine a weary peasant sneaking a glance at such a dish and muttering under his breath about nobles eating sunshine while he chewed on turnips. You peer into the kitchen and see small cloth bags hanging from rafters, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg. The cook guards them carefully, knowing theft could mean dismissal or worse. Servants whisper that even the smell of these spices marks out a noble household. You chuckle, realizing that in medieval Europe, it was possible to smell wealth before you saw it. Meanwhile, peasants flavor their food with what they have: garlic, mustard seeds, horseradish, nettles, sharp, pungent, bitter. These herbs give strength to bland pottage, though they lack the prestige of exotic spices. Yet in their way, they are just as important. They show resilience, turning what is available into something edible, even memorable. The chest of salt is locked away again, carried with reverence, while the spice jars vanish back into guarded cupboards. The feast continues, nobles chewing loudly, peasants waiting for scraps. The flavors are uneven, divided by wealth, but the need is the same. You sip a spoonful of saffron-colored broth, its taste earthy and faintly metallic. You swallow, your tongue buzzing with pepper's heat. This is the flavor of the privileged few, fiery, exotic, expensive. For most, the taste of life is cabbage, onion, and garlic. You sigh, amused at how flavor itself became a game, a contest of wealth and status. You would not last a day, trapped between monotony and excess, either gnawing bland bread or choking on overspiced venison. But for medieval people, this was the theatre of taste, a daily reminder that food was never just food, it was fortune in disguise. The torches in the hall burn lower, their smoke curling upward, when a servant brings out a small clay pot wrapped in cloth. He opens it carefully, and the smell of honey drifts into the air, rich, floral, and sticky. In a world without refined sugar, honey is the sweetest taste most people will ever know. It glistens in the firelight, thick and golden, a treasure gathered not from trade routes, but from hives hidden in fields and forests. You dip a wooden spoon into the pot. The honey clings, stretching in slow strands before finally dripping onto your bread. The taste is intense, sweeter than anything else you have encountered here. It floods your mouth with warmth, soothing after so much salt, bitterness, and smoke. A mainstream fact: honey was the primary sweetener across medieval Europe until sugar slowly entered through trade. A quirky tidbit: some monasteries kept extensive beehives, not just for honey, but for beeswax, used in candles. The glow of a church at night depended on bees as much as prayers. For peasants, honey is rare. They might find wild hives and risk stings to gather it, smoke puffing against the angry swarm, hands sticky as they break the comb. A family could treasure even a small pot for weeks, using it sparingly to sweeten gruel or heal wounds. Honey was medicine too, believed to soothe throats, seal cuts, and strengthen the body. You picture a mother feeding her sick child a spoonful, hoping sweetness itself might drive out fever. Sugar, by contrast, is exotic, imported at enormous cost from the Middle East and later from Mediterranean plantations. In the 13th century, sugar is still so expensive that it is sold by the ounce, often stored in locked boxes like jewels. You imagine a noble cook grating a lump of crystallized sugar over a pie, the guests gasping not at the flavor but at the extravagance. Historians still argue whether sugar was considered medicine or luxury food in its early days. Many medieval texts describe it as both, recommended for digestion, strength, and even melancholy. Quirky detail: early sugar was shaped into cones, called sugar loaves, which had to be chipped apart with special tongs. Imagine struggling to break off a piece of sweetness with the same effort you use to split firewood. It makes your modern spoonful of sugar feel absurdly easy. At noble banquets, sweet dishes take on theatrical flair. Almond milk, thickened with rice or wheat, is sweetened with sugar or honey, becoming custards or blancmange. Fruits are stewed in syrup, nuts candied into brittle, wine boiled with spices and sweeteners into mulled drinks. The guests marvel not just at the taste but at the cost. Sweetness itself is currency, paraded before them to remind everyone of the Lord's wealth. In cottages, sweetness looks different. A farmer dips bread into honey on a festival day, his children's eyes wide with delight. Berries are boiled with a spoonful of honey, creating a makeshift jam that lasts only as long as the jar does. The sweetness is fleeting, savoured, remembered. You smile, realizing how rare pleasure made it all the more powerful. The pot of honey passes down the table, each spoonful disappearing quickly. Your fingers stick together, and you lick them clean, the taste clinging long after the bread is gone. In this moment, you understand how sugar and honey shape not just meals, but memory. Sweetness here is not background noise, it is revelation. You lean back, the aftertaste still lingering, and sigh. You would not last a day without craving more of this golden comfort. But for medieval people, honey and early sugar were fleeting miracles, reminders that even in a world of salt, smoke, and bitterness, life sometimes offered a taste of pure light. The hall grows noisier as the feast stretches on, and you notice that what is happening around you is not just dining, it is theatre. Medieval banquets are performances as much as meals, staged with props, costumes, and timing. You watch servants stride across the hall, carrying massive platters high above their heads, each one announced like an act in a play. Meat gleams, sauces glisten, and the audience, because that is what the diners are, lean forward in anticipation. A mainstream fact: banquets in noble courts were deliberately choreographed to demonstrate wealth and power. The food was designed to impress, not merely to satisfy hunger. This is why dishes were sometimes painted with gold leaf, dyed with saffron, or sculpted into elaborate shapes. A quirky tidbit: whole peacocks were sometimes roasted and then redressed in their own feathers before being brought out, their tails fanned wide to look magnificent. Though eating the dry meat was far less enjoyable than the spectacle suggested. You glance around the long table and see how everyone is arranged by rank. Nobles sit nearest the lord, common retainers further away, and servants or musicians on the periphery. Every movement, from who gets served first to how many courses reach each rank, signals social order. You, as the outsider, feel awkwardly placed, unsure whether you should lean forward or stay back. You realize that this is less about eating than reminding everyone who belongs where. Then comes a dish so strange you cannot help but laugh. A pie is placed on the table, its crust carefully sealed. When the lid is broken, live birds flutter out into the hall, wings beating, guests shrieking with both delight and irritation. Historians still argue whether these surprise pies were common or rare exaggerations told in chronicles. but the image of doves flying from pastry has clung to history. You brush feathers off your cloak and chuckle. Wine flows more freely, and the entertainment sharpens. Jongleurs tumble, jugglers throw knives, musicians pluck strings, and sometimes, if the Lord wishes to display greater wealth, a troupe of actors performs morality plays between courses. The food and entertainment weave together, creating an endless rhythm. Eat, marvel, laugh, drink, repeat. You sense how overwhelming this must have felt for someone used to a quiet hearth and simple stew. At your side, a man explains that each dish is meant to symbolize something: swans for nobility, boar for ferocity, sugar sculptures for refinement. The table is a stage, and every bite carries meaning beyond taste. A quirky note. Sometimes a roasted animal was stuffed with smaller roasted animals inside, like a goose inside a pig, inside a cow. A grotesque but theatrical show of abundance. You whisper to yourself, you would not last a day trying to stomach that. The hall smells of roasted meat, sweet spices, sweat, and smoke. The fire pops, dogs lurk beneath benches for scraps, and laughter rolls like thunder. For a moment, you forget that you are supposed to be a guest and feel more like an audience member at a grand, chaotic opera where the food is part of the script. As another round of music begins, you notice your own weariness. The food is rich, the air heavy, and yet the energy in the hall builds instead of fades. Banquets like these could last for hours, even days, with guests drifting in and out, servants constantly replenishing platters, and musicians playing until their fingers blistered. You imagine the poor kitchen staff behind the scenes, exhausted and sweating. Their theatre hidden from the glittering stage out here. The Lord raises his goblet, a signal for silence, and the hall obeys instantly. He gives a short speech, more like a sermon, reminding everyone of loyalty, honor, and the generosity of his household. It is both feast and message, a performance of authority. You sip your watered wine and nod, pretending you understand the deeper political currents in his words. When the goblet is lowered, the noise resumes, the theatre continues, and you realize that this is not just a meal, it is propaganda served with sauce. You rub your eyes, sleepy but alert, knowing that the banquet is far from finished. You lean forward as another platter appears, wondering what absurdity or marvel will be unveiled next. The hall's laughter echoes, but when you glance toward the shuttered windows, you sense another story unfolding in the cold outside. For every noble banquet stacked with golden platters, there are hundreds of villagers crouched in huts, scraping the bottom of clay pots for scraps of broth. The contrast is staggering, and you feel it press on you like the weight of winter air. A mainstream fact: famine was not rare in medieval Europe. Even in years of average harvests, many peasants lived so close to the edge of survival that one poor season could mean starvation. Crop failures due to bad weather, pests, or war pushed entire communities into hunger. A quirky tidbit: there are records of people baking famine bread from acorns, weeds, and even ground-up tree bark mixed with a little flour. Historians still argue whether such loaves were widely consumed or desperate exceptions. But the image of chewing bark bread lingers grimly in the imagination. Imagine yourself in a tiny hut on the edge of a muddy village. The air inside is thick with smoke from the hearth, but the fire is weak and the stew pot hangs nearly empty. You peer inside and see only a thin liquid, stretched with cabbage leaves and maybe a sliver of salted meat left over from last week. Children huddle near the embers, their bellies aching, eyes heavy. This is hunger, not an empty stomach for a few hours, but a grinding, constant ache that defines life. The irony strikes you. At the same moment, nobles gorge themselves on peacock pies and almond custards, peasants boil nettles and hope for spring. It is not just about food, it is about power. The Lord's feast, so theatrical and lavish, depends on rents, tithes and taxes collected from the very villagers who go hungry. You wonder how many peasants' meals were taken so that swans could be roasted and served under chandeliers. Sometimes hunger takes on strange forms. There are stories of people gnawing bones that dogs had licked clean, or of mothers soaking stale crusts in water overnight just to soften them enough to chew. In times of true famine, markets empty, prices rise, and desperation seeps into every corner. Even monasteries with their stored grain become fortresses against the starving. Peasants line up at their gates hoping for charity, knowing they may be turned away. Historians still debate whether such desperate scenes were daily reality or rare disasters recorded because of their extremity. But famine years are well documented. 1315 to 1317 brought the Great Famine, where rain drowned crops across northern Europe, livestock perished, and entire towns reeled from hunger. You picture mud-choked roads, wagons carrying shriveled bodies, and villages silent except for the cough of the weak. You shiver. Quirky note, some peasants believed that famine was caused by witches or divine punishment, and priests often preached repentance as the only solution. Superstition and hunger twisted together, shaping not only what people ate but how they thought about why they suffered. You realize how fragile medieval life was. There is no grocery store safety net, no frozen reserves, no global trade to balance a poor harvest. One storm could undo months of labor. The banquet hall is loud and warm, but the silence outside is more powerful. You cannot escape the sense that the food you just ate was bought with someone else's hunger. As the servants bring yet another round of roasted meat, you turn your head away, appetite dimmed. The performance continues around you, but your mind drifts to a hut filled with smoke, where a family scrapes a pot for the last drops of cabbage water. The truth is sharp. You would not last a day with such hunger gnawing at you, not when you are used to plenty. The peasants endured it with grit, prayer, and luck, but for you it would be unbearable. And that perhaps is the deepest irony of all. You sit at the table of history's extremes, where one end feasts while the other starves. The hall grows quieter for a moment as a new course is served, and you notice the fragrance rising from the platters is different from the earthy smells of roasted meat. It is sharper, warmer, almost exotic. You lean closer, and there it is, the unmistakable hint of cinnamon, pepper, and cloves. In a world without refrigeration, these spices are not only luxuries, but tools for survival. A mainstream fact, salt was the single most essential preservative in medieval Europe. Without it, meat spoiled, fish rotted, and cheese curdled too quickly. Salt allowed communities to carry food through winter, to feed armies on campaign, and to sustain trade across seas. Whole towns existed because of salt mines, their wealth measured in white crystals. A quirky tidbit. The word salary itself comes from salt, a reminder that this mineral once carried the value of currency. Historians still argue whether salt was truly scarce in all regions, or whether its scarcity was exaggerated to elevate its prestige. You picture rows of barrels filled with salted herring, stacked in damp cellars to feed an entire monastery through Lent. The fish are stiff, pale and briny, but they keep hunger away when fresh food is scarce. Soldiers on the march chew tough slabs of salted pork, the flavor overpowering, but the alternative is worse. You grimace, realizing that while salt preserved life, it also preserved monotony. Then there are the spices: pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, each grain or shard a fragment of faraway worlds. To your modern eyes, a pinch of pepper seems ordinary, but here it is worth its weight in silver.
Merchants risk storms, pirates, and bandits to bring it across oceans and deserts,
where it will end up in a noble's kitchen, sprinkled into sauces or wine. You taste a spoonful of stew, heavy with pepper, and it burns your tongue. Guests around you laugh at your cough, but they nod approvingly, proud of their host's ability to afford such extravagance. Spices mask not only the flavor of preserved meat, but also proclaim wealth. A lord who serves cinnamon-laced wine is not only feeding his guests, he is broadcasting his global connections. Quirky detail. Medieval cooks sometimes used saffron not for taste, but for color. A dish, tinted golden, looked instantly richer, more magical. Imagine a bowl of rice glowing like sunlight, the taste almost secondary to the sight. It is theatre again, this time painted in yellow threads. Salt, meanwhile, is democratic.
Nobles and peasants alike need it, but they experience it differently.
A lord might keep blocks of pure white salt in a carved box, while a peasant sprinkles coarse grey crystals sparingly into a pot of cabbage soup. In lean years, salt itself could be scarce, and whole meals were ruined by the lack of it. Historians still argue whether spices were actually used to cover up spoiled meat, or if that is just a modern exaggeration. Evidence suggests nobles valued fresh meat just as much as anyone else, and spices were more about prestige than concealment. Still, in smoky kitchens where meat hung for days, a heavy hand of pepper or clove could transform a dubious cut into something passable. Imagine walking through a market in a port town. The smell of fish is overwhelming, but nearby, merchants hawk tiny packets of spice with great ceremony. A few black peppercorns carefully wrapped might cost a week's wages for a laborer. You pick them up, feeling the weightless beads roll in your palm, and wonder how something so small could carry such power. As the feast resumes, you realize that what you are tasting is more than flavor. It is trade, geography, empire, all condensed into grains, crystals, and threads. The salt under your tongue comes from mines carved deep into mountains, the pepper from ships that have crossed the Indian Ocean, the saffron from crocuses hand-plucked by peasants in fields far away. Every bite here is a map, every swallow a lesson in global history. You lick your lips, the burn of pepper still clinging, and you smile at the absurdity of it. You would not last a day eating salted herring without complaint, nor could you afford a pinch of cinnamon without selling half your belongings. And yet for medieval people, salt and spices were the difference between survival and spectacle, between bare existence and a banquet's glow. The feast in the hall roars on, but if you step beyond the manor's walls and wander toward the quiet cloisters of a monastery, you discover a very different rhythm of dining. Here there are no jesters, no golden platters, no roasted peacocks strutting back to life in their feathers. Instead, there is silence, discipline, and a focus on the soul rather than the belly. A mainstream fact: monasteries were among the most regulated dining environments in medieval Europe. Monks followed strict rules laid down in texts like the Rule of St. Benedict, which limited what, when, and how they ate. Meals were communal but restrained, intended to prevent gluttony and encourage humility. A quirky tidbit: monks were forbidden to eat meat from four-legged animals for centuries, though fish and poultry often slipped through the rules with creative justification. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were universally followed or widely bent, especially in wealthy abbeys with access to ample resources. Picture yourself sitting at a long wooden refectory table, the stone walls around you echoing faintly with the scrape of wooden spoons.
No one speaks.
A single monk at a lectern reads aloud from a sacred text while the others eat, reminding them that nourishment is for the body, but words are for the soul. The meal is plain: bread, pottage made of beans or lentils, perhaps a bit of cheese, and always watered ale. It is steady, filling, but not indulgent. The idea of fasting dominates monastic life. Not just the grand fast of Lent, but dozens of smaller fast days throughout the year. On these days, meat disappears, and the meals grow even simpler. vegetables, legumes, bread, and water. For a modern eater like you, the repetition would feel punishing. You imagine your stomach grumbling, your eyes wandering toward the kitchens of the feasting hall you left behind. You whisper to yourself, you would not last a day here without sneaking a sausage. Yet monasteries were not austere in every sense. Many became centers of agriculture and brewing. Monks developed orchards, vineyards, and fish ponds, ensuring steady supplies of food within their walls. The famous brewing traditions of Belgium and Germany trace their roots to monastic beer, designed not for intoxication, but for safe nourishment when water was questionable. Drink enough of it, though, and the holiness of its purpose begins to wobble. A quirky note. Some monks became notorious for interpreting fasting rules generously. While they could not eat meat from four-legged animals, they argued that beavers counted as fish because they swam. Thus, roasted beaver tails occasionally appeared on fast day menus. You cannot help but grin at the creativity of hungry, holy men. Historians still argue about whether fasting improved health or weakened bodies. Some suggest that periodic abstinence reduced disease and stretched resources, while others point to malnutrition among strict orders. The truth may lie in the balance. Monks lived longer than peasants, not because their diet was extravagant, but because it was relatively consistent and clean compared to what famine-stricken villages endured. Imagine walking through a monastery's kitchen garden in early spring. Rows of cabbages and leeks struggle in the cold, herbs sprout cautiously, and a fish pond ripples with movement.
It is not abundance, but it is steady.
You realize how carefully the monks planned their sustenance, tying faith to farming, prayer to preservation. At mealtime, there is no clatter of gossip, no laughter at spilled wine. The silence is heavy, almost meditative. You chew your bread slowly, listening to the scripture echo, feeling the humility pressed into every bite. It is not designed to impress, only to sustain. You sigh, imagining how long you would last in such discipline. A week perhaps before your craving for variety broke you. For monks, though, the simplicity was the point. Food was never meant to distract them from heaven. It was meant to remind them that earth was fleeting. And so, as the noble's hall fills with the sound of fiddles and clinking cups, the monastery just down the road hums with quiet chewing and whispered prayers. Two worlds side by side, divided not just by wealth, but by intention.
One eats to celebrate power.
The other eats to deny it. Both, however, reveal what mattered most in the Middle Ages: survival of the body and salvation of the soul. The clamour of the guild hall fades, and you follow the scent of frying oil and roasting meat down a narrow, crowded street. Here the world feels different again. The feast is not confined to lords or guild masters. It spills into the alleys, the marketplaces, the very stones of the town square. If you cannot afford a banquet, you might still afford a bite from a vendor's stall. A mainstream fact: medieval towns were alive with street food.
Markets bustled not just with goods to take home, but with ready-to-eat fare: meat pies, hot pancakes, roasted chestnuts, and grilled fish.
In cities like London or Paris, stalls fed workers who had no time or space to cook during the day. A quirky tidbit: pie sellers sometimes reused fillings for days, layering fresh crust over stale contents. If you thought your lunch was new, it might just be yesterday's stew reheated in pastry. Historians still argue how widespread food poisoning really was from such practices. But complaints about bad pies appear often in records. You push through the crowd. The cobblestones slick with mud and straw. Shouts fill the air. A baker hawks meat-filled pastries. A woman ladles out steaming pottage from a cauldron, and a boy sells roasted apples on sticks. The smells are overwhelming: sweet, savory, smoky, and sometimes sour when fish has lingered too long in the sun. You press a coin into a greasy hand and receive a small pie, its crust cracked and uneven, steam escaping in little hisses. You take a cautious bite. The filling is hot, peppery, and chewy. though you hesitate to guess whether it is pork, beef, or something else entirely. You grin at the uncertainty and whisper, "You would not last a day eating mystery pies." And yet, for townsfolk, this is convenience, fast, cheap, and filling, even if it leaves your stomach rumbling later. Street food was not only for the poor. Wealthier citizens grabbed snacks too, enjoying spiced nuts, candied fruits, or sweet wafers baked on iron plates. In fairs and festivals, vendors sold extravagant treats like gingerbread shaped into saints or animals, painted with bright colors. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, eyes wide at the sight of gilded sugar confections. Quirky detail, some vendors sold hot wine mulled with herbs, ladled from large cauldrons into wooden cups. Imagine standing in the cold, your hands wrapped around a steaming drink spiced with cinnamon and cloves, the warmth seeping into your bones. It was comfort in liquid form, even if the wine was sour to begin with. Historians still argue how hygienic these stalls were. Critics of the time often wrote that markets reeked of filth, with butchers slaughtering animals nearby and sewage running in gutters. Food vendors worked side by side with fishmongers, tanners, and blacksmiths. You picture flies buzzing above your pie, the clatter of hooves in the mud, and you cannot help but laugh. Modern health inspectors would faint, yet for the townsfolk, the market was life. Workers ate on the go, apprentices grabbed a hot cake between tasks, and travellers arriving at the city gates bought their first meal here. You imagine sailors stepping off ships, tossing a coin to a pie seller, and sinking their teeth into the taste of land again. The soundscape is part of it. Bells ring from a nearby church, vendors shout prices, children squeal, dogs bark, and somewhere a fiddler plays for coins. It is chaotic but alive, a feast available to anyone with a penny. For a moment you forget about noble banquets and monastic fasts. This is the heartbeat of the medieval town. Cheap, hot food in your hand, eaten as you jostle through the crowd. As you finish the last crumb of your pie, you notice your stomach feels both satisfied and suspicious. You chuckle, shaking your head. You would not last a day eating only from these stalls without needing a long nap, or maybe a strong prayer. But for medieval townsfolk, the stalls were freedom. They brought food into the streets, turned hunger into opportunity, and made the market not just a place of trade, but a place of taste. You step away from the monastery's quiet refectory, where silence lingers heavier than steam above a pot of lentils, and wander into a bustling town square. The air changes instantly. It smells of roasting meat, spiced pies, and sweet wine. Here, the world of guilds and townsfolk bursts with a different kind of dining culture, one filled with pageantry and the unspoken competition of who can throw the better feast. A mainstream fact, by the later Middle Ages, guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants, were at the heart of town life. They organized not only work, but also religious and social events, often marked with banquets. These meals were chances to celebrate patron saints, welcome new members, or display the wealth and solidarity of the guild. A quirky tidbit: some guilds had unique rules about meals, such as requiring members to provide candles, spices, or even pies at their own expense during feasts. Historians still argue whether these gatherings truly benefited
All members equally, or if they mostly
reinforced hierarchies within the guilds themselves. You imagine sitting at one of the long trestle tables beneath a timbered hall. The walls adorned with banners displaying hammers, looms or fish hooks depending on the trade. The chatter is not hushed like in a monastery, but thunderous. Tankards slam, jokes fly, and someone always attempts to start a song too early. You shift in your seat, grinning, trying not to spill ale as the rhythm of the room carries you away. The menu is ambitious: roasted beef or pork if the guild is wealthy, eel pies and salted herring if the coffers are thin. Spices, once rare, have become symbols of status, so pepper and cinnamon might make appearances in meat dishes and puddings alike. A town baker's guild might boast sugared pastries shaped like their emblems, while a fishmonger's guild could serve salted cod on elaborate platters with lemon slices. Imported at extravagant cost, it is not just food, it is theatre. Imagine a roasted boar carried into the hall with an apple in its mouth, flames flickering in the dim light, while a musician strums a lute to announce its arrival. Apprentices watch with wide eyes, dreaming of the day they will sit closer to the masters and get first pick of the meat. Journeymen trade gossip about market prices, while masters nod sagely, chewing slowly, pretending to be above it all even as they steal the last slice of pie. A quirky example. In some towns, guilds staged public banquets where ordinary townsfolk could watch the masters eat as proof of their prosperity. You picture yourself standing outside in the cold, sniffing the roasted goose drifting out of the hall, while the wealthy inside raise their goblets high. You mutter, you would not last a day being left outside like this. Historians still argue whether guild feasts strengthened community bonds or widened social divides. On one hand, apprentices were invited and some guilds pooled resources to help members during hard times. On the other hand, the elaborate feasts often revealed just how unequal life was, with guild leaders feasting in abundance while the lower ranks waited for scraps. The sensory details cling to you. You hear the squeak of a fiddle, the stomping of boots as a jig begins. You feel the warmth of the fire, the brush of woolen sleeves as neighbours jostle for space. You see children darting between tables, sneaking bits of bread, laughing when caught. It is not just a meal. It is a declaration of identity. We are bakers, we are butchers, we are brewers, and we eat to prove it. And beyond the guild halls, towns themselves celebrated with public feasts. Coronations, royal visits, or religious festivals brought food out into the streets.
Imagine a long table stretching across the square, barrels of ale cracked open, bread and cheese handed freely to the poor, for one day, at least.
The mayor beams, the church bells ring, and everyone pretends this generosity will last longer than the festival. In your mind, you shuffle between the nobles' hall, the monks' refectory, and the guild banquet.
And you realize something.
Food is never just food. It is power, it is identity, it is a loud announcement of who belongs and who watches hungrily from the sidelines. You might last a day here if you are lucky enough to sit at the table. But if you are the one waiting outside, the feast is a reminder. History often tastes best for those already full. The market noise fades as you wander toward a quieter corner, where an apothecary's shop glows by candlelight. Inside, shelves bend under the weight of jars, sacks, and dried bundles of herbs. You realize that in the medieval world, food and medicine were not so separate. What you ate was believed to shape not only your health, but your very character. A mainstream fact, medieval medicine was grounded in the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Food was thought to balance or imbalance these humours, directly influencing your well-being. For example, beef was considered hot and moist, while lettuce was cold and wet. A quirky tidbit, physicians sometimes prescribed roasted owl for gout or recommended hair broth to improve eyesight. Historians still argue whether these beliefs had any real effect or were simply layers of tradition stitched onto everyday eating. Imagine sitting at a healer's bench as he explains that too. Much pork will make you sluggish, while wine will warm your blood and cheer your spirit. He hands you a cup of mulled wine spiced with cloves and honey, calling it both comfort and cure. You sip and the sweetness fills your mouth. You cannot help but chuckle. You would not last a day trusting owl's soup to heal a fever. Quirky detail, garlic was thought to ward off not only illness, but also evil spirits. Soldiers carried cloves of garlic into battle, peasants hung braids of it by their doors, and physicians recommended it for digestion. The smell was strong enough that you imagine it probably worked, at least in keeping people at a distance. The monastery gardens were filled with simples, herbs grown for both cooking and cures: sage, parsley, mint, fennel and rosemary. Monks compiled herbals, books describing plants and their healing powers, blending practical knowledge with folklore. A woman with a stomachache might be given chamomile tea, a man with a cough, a syrup of honey and thyme. Food and healing blurred until they were one and the same. Historians still debate how effective these remedies were. Some argue that diets heavy in grains and vegetables with limited meat may have kept many peasants healthier than nobles who indulged in constant rich feasts. Others suggest malnutrition and deficiencies were widespread, masked only by the stories people told about humours and herbs. In towns, apothecaries mixed expensive imported ingredients, spices, sugar, even powdered gems into syrups and electuaries. A wealthy merchant might pay dearly for a sugar-based tonic believed to cure melancholy. You shake your head, imagining the taste: gritty, syrupy, half medicine, half candy. But even the poorest clung to belief in the curative power of food. Onion poultices pressed against wounds, vinegar sipped for fevers, beer drunk to cleanse the blood. Every kitchen was a pharmacy, every meal a potential cure. Superstition wrapped itself around meals too. Some people swore by eating certain foods on holy days to ward off illness or misfortune. You picture a mother feeding her child pottage with a muttered prayer, believing the herbs within carried not only nourishment but blessing. Or a weary farmer swallowing garlic before heading to the fields, hoping to keep both sickness and demons at bay. The idea that food could heal or harm gave every meal weight. Eating was not casual, it was deliberate, a choice tied to body and soul. For you it feels strange, almost heavy, as if every bite carried a diagnosis. You would not last a day worrying whether bread was warming your blood too much. But for medieval people, such thinking was daily life. The apothecary closes his jars, the herbs rustle, and the shop darkens. You step back into the street, realizing that in this world, food is medicine, medicine is food, and belief binds them both. What you swallow is never just taste, it is fate. The apothecary's door shuts behind you, and you find yourself back beneath the dimming sky, the scents of roasted meat, honey, and smoke drifting faintly through the air. You pause, reflecting on everything you have seen. The noble banquets dripping with theatre, the peasant huts clinging to scraps, the monks chewing in silence, the guilds boasting with pies, and the market stalls frying food of questionable origins. All of it, woven together, forms the tapestry of medieval eating. A mainstream fact: medieval diets, despite their stark inequalities, laid the groundwork for much of Europe's later food culture. The reliance on bread, the brewing of ale, the cultivation of vineyards, and the introduction of sugar and spices set patterns that continued for centuries. A quirky tidbit: cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries survive, filled with recipes that read like spells. Take hens, boil them in almond milk, add sugar and saffron, and serve with pride. Historians still argue whether these recipes reflected common practice or idealized fantasies meant only for the richest kitchens. You breathe in deeply, as though the smoky scent of past centuries still lingers. The reality is clear: food was never neutral. It was survival, power, medicine, and identity. A nobleman's feast spoke of alliances. A monk's fast reflected faith. A peasant's pottage embodied endurance. Even the humblest meal was tied to a wider story. Quirky detail: some festivals ended with entire oxen roasted on spits in the town square, the meat carved and handed out freely to all. For a brief moment, the hierarchy blurred, and everyone ate together. Yet the moment never lasted long. Hunger returned, and so did division. You realize that food in the Middle Ages was always about more than taste. It was a negotiation with nature, a gamble against famine, a theatre of wealth, and a ritual of belief. It demanded resilience from peasants, discipline from monks, extravagance from nobles, and adaptability from townsfolk. Picture yourself now back at the noble's high table. The goblet of wine gleams, the roast glistens, the fiddler plays, but outside, in huts and stalls, life continues in very different flavors. You smile softly, shaking your head. You would not last a day navigating these extremes without longing for the comforts of your own kitchen. And yet, walking through this history, you feel the echoes of your own meals, bread on the table, salt in the cupboard, spices in jars, honey in the tea. The past is not gone. It lingers in every bite. The torches burn lower, the hall grows quiet, and the medieval world drifts away like smoke. You are left with the knowledge that to eat here is to understand not just hunger and satisfaction, but the full spectrum of human existence, played out in bowls, loaves, and goblets. And so, as the last echoes of laughter fade, you lean back, close your eyes, and let the history of food settle into a gentle hum in your thoughts. It is absurd, strange, sometimes cruel, sometimes sweet, but it is all part of the story. The tale softens now like embers cooling at the bottom of a hearth. You have walked through kitchens smoky with grease, through huts rattling in the wind, through monasteries where silence clung to every bite, and through markets alive with pies and shouting. You have eaten with peasants, monks, merchants, and lords. And at every turn, you learned that food was never simply about hunger. It was about meaning. Perhaps you hear the echo of knives on wooden boards, the whisper of herbs crushed in a mortar, the crackle of salted fish over a fire. Perhaps you feel the warmth of a shared loaf, or the sharp sting of pepper on your tongue. These details do not vanish with centuries. They linger, reminding you that every meal today carries echoes of 1,000 years of human habit. You smile softly at the thought. You are full now, not with food, but with story. And if you let your eyes grow heavy, the banquets, the stalls, the gardens, and the feasts will blur into one long dream of flavor. So rest easy. The past has been served, its courses laid out one by one, from sour ale to golden honey. There is nothing more to chew on tonight. Sleep well, knowing that history has fed you.